Agave Utahensis is one of the most sought after species of agave by collectors around the world. And one of the reasons is that it's really, really small and super duper cool looking. But it's also very slow growing and a little bit different to even if you're used to cactuses. It's not exactly like taking care of a cactus. So today what we're going to be talking about is how to care for Agave Utahensis plants in cultivation. So Agave Utahensis obviously grows in really bright deserts, right? And so if you're going to be growing it indoors, like I do, it's entirely possible to do. You're just going to need to provide it with some extra lighting. In fact, I don't actually even think it's possible to buy a artificial lighting system that would give Agave Utahensis too much light. I guess potentially you could overheat it, but if you kept the temperatures under control, I think you could pretty much handle any artificial lighting system you can give it. So with that said, what you're going to look for is the highest power lighting situation you can put in your space. There are a bunch of LED panels on Amazon that work fine. There are a bunch of more expensive brands that also work fine. And you can also just use high lumen LED light bulbs as long as they're positioned fairly close to the plant. If you have some natural lighting in the space, you might get away with having a little bit lower power artificial lighting, or the artificial lighting being a little bit further away. But growing Agave Utahensis indoors, lighting and providing as much lighting to look the best that it can is really going to be the biggest challenge. It's entirely possible, but that is going to be the biggest challenge. And if you're trying to grow Agave Utahensis outdoors, the most important thing you're going to need to think about is whether or not the plants that you've gotten that you're going to be putting outside are acclimated to the kind of sun conditions you're putting them into. Are you putting them into a full sun situation? Are you putting them into partial shade or, partial sun throughout the day, depending on where the shadows are cast? Because Agave Utahensis seedlings, that is, up to about a year old, will melt in the sun in a matter of hours here in the desert in Las Vegas, for instance. So if you're in a warmer climate or a climate that gets a lot of harsh sun, you can expect that to happen as well if you're not acclimating your plants to the sunlight properly. And what that basically will mean is taking them and putting them outside for a short amount of time one day, a little bit longer time the next day, a little bit longer time the next day, and so on, until the plants are used to the amount of light they're going to get when they're sitting where they're going to be normally outside. Agave Utahensis normally lives in limestone-based soils, and these soils are alkaline, and they're very rich in micro and macronutrients like calcium, phosphorus, and iron. In many parts of Agave Utahensis' range, that limestone-based soil, basically gravel, is mixed with something called mollisoil, which is highly organic soil composed of basically decaying dead plants that does provide quite a bit of organic material to Agave Utahensis, and those populations seem to love it. Research on other forms of agave have also shown that micronutrients like boron are very important when fertilizing agave. So in choosing a product to fertilize agave with, I like to look for something that has a relatively low NPK score, relatively low macronutrients, in compared to the amount of micronutrients. That's the long list of things in the back that the fertilizer have. There's two products specifically that I really love. One is Clonex Liquid Solution, and the other one is Flora Micro. And those limestone-rich soils that Agave Utahensis normally lives in are generally very well draining. Now, in a lot of places, there's that mollisoil, like I mentioned, that's mixed in with gravel, but in other places, that's just cracks in basically solid limestone faces. And what that means is that when you're cultivating Agave Utahensis, whether indoors or outdoors, it needs to be in a fast-draining medium. Now, I live in the desert here in Las Vegas, so I can get away with putting a lot more organic material in my soil mix than you may be able to if you live in a more humid climate. Basically, the key, though, is to ensure that in between each watering of an Agave Utahensis plant, the soil is completely drying out. Again, where I live, Las Vegas, is very dry, and I use a ton of fans around my Agave Utahensis plants, so my drying out time is very quick. And in fact, what I've done is I've measured individual plants or trays of plants before and after I water them to determine how much water I'm adding to them and how quickly that water evaporates. And after doing that for a little while, basically you can graph it in Excel if you're a nerd like I am, and you can see a pattern over time. And what that will do is will teach you how often you can water your agave. Research on other forms of agave has shown that basically increased growth rate can be achieved through increased watering. The more water, the faster the growth rate. And with Agave Utahensis, a lot of its populations live in places where they see a decent amount of snow cover throughout the winter, so it's not like a bunch of water is really going to be a problem for them. Those populations are doing very, very well. So again, as long as it's drying out in between waterings, My goal with growing Agave Utahensis is generally to put as much water into the plant as I can while ensuring that it's drying out in between. So I definitely would recommend using a lot of fans, regardless of where you live, whether you live in a dry climate like I do here in Vegas, or you live in somewhere more humid. Definitely invest in a couple of fans. They don't need to be big, they don't need to be loud, but point them in the general direction of your plants. More the better, the more the merrier. And when it comes to fans, much like when it comes to lights, but using fans will definitely speed up the amount of time it takes for your plants to dry out and thus allow you to water them more frequently and I believe achieve faster levels of growth. And so that fast draining soil, right? Like I said, I live in Las Vegas, so I can put a lot more organic material than you're going to be able to if you live in a humid climate. But my soil mix is approximately 25% store-bought cactus soil mix, 25% worm castings, and then the rest is made up of a mix of like perlite, pumice, lava, depending on what's available, turfus, that sort of inorganic material. But if you live in a more humid climate, you may want to dial down the percentage of worm castings and store-bought cactus mix. And if there are materials that are cheaper in your area, easier to get in your area, you can definitely substitute them. I don't think there's anything sort of magical about any of these ingredients, so much as it's important that the soil mix is well drained, because again, you want the soil to be dried out in between each watering, and you want to be able to water as frequently as possible. So I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's your experience been like cultivating Agave Utahensis, whether that is outside or inside? How often do you water? What kind of fertilizers do you use? What kind of soil do you use? Or if you're thinking about starting to grow Agave Utahensis, what are your questions? Do you have any questions that I can hope to answer in the comments?